Welcome, David. Thank you for sitting down to talk with me today. We had a conversation a few years ago, you may or may not remember, when we were both teaching music. And we were thinking about, in sophomore music, we do musical analysis, harmonic analysis of different pieces, not that different than what we do when we do close readings of other texts, to sort of dig into the details to try to figure out what's going on. And I remember you made a comment that I thought was really interesting, about the way that harmonic analysis might reveal something, which is not exactly what's, the meaning of a text, but sort of the world that the text is coming out of. What I was thinking of, the sort of epistemological context, sort of the artist is walking through the world, experiencing it in a certain way, and that might seep into the piece of art in a way that we might detect in the case of music, harmonic analysis. I think we were talking about sort of the 1-4-5 movement, which is so characteristic of so much music we listen to. In any case, I thought that was really interesting, thinking about the way art reflects sort of a walk through the world. And I thought I wanted to start there. I'd like to ask you about that in general, just hear you think about that a little bit. But also, ultimately, and this doesn't have to happen immediately, I know that you are a photographer, and I'm curious about how that thinking informs your own work, or how you think those two things together.
What I think I recall of that conversation was that I was saying something about the way that the structure of music reflects something about the human experience generally. That one of the motifs for most of us in experience is going away from home and then returning home, and that's one of the structural aspects of the musical traditions that we study in sophomore music. So there's that level, which has to do with the way that the thing is crafted, but I probably had in mind also, or certainly have in mind these days, the way that art is conveying a general sense of the world. Not just a motif like away from home and return to home, but also some sense of what kind of world this is, what kind of quality it has, or what its atmosphere is. Mm-hmm. And one way to understand the books that we study is that they are sharing with us a particular sense of what it's like to inhabit the world and what kind of world this is. Mm-hmm. And maybe helping equip us to navigate the world better.
Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder whether, do you think that capacity for art to reflect the world that we live in, is that on the artist's mind? Is that something intentional, or is it the reflection you kind of can't help it as someone who's living in a world? Mm-hmm. I want to think that relationship between the making mm-hmm. of the art and these larger sort of forces at work. Mm-hmm. How do you think about that?
I think the level on which we can't help it is very important, because that's our sort of that's what becomes the ordinary way of being for us, is that we have some sense of what it is to be a person, or a sense of what kind of world this is, and we proceed on that basis. And so I think for most of us, it doesn't become especially conscious. It's just our sort of our way of operating. And what might be distinctive about artists and people who do a lot of thinking and writing is that they try to bring that forward in a more explicit way. And I would say that part of what we're seeking when we encounter art or we read a good book is is some stronger, more coherent way of being in the world. So while for most of us it is just a kind of background thing, and we're not especially aware of it, we sometimes sense that there's some kind of deficiency, or that we're not as poised as we would like, or we're not as happy as we would like, or the world isn't making sense to us. And so then what the artist or the writer or the philosopher can offer is some rendering of a more coherent world. So I think for most of us, it's in the background. It's something we can't help or we don't address directly. But then there can be a more deliberate effort to bring it forward, make it available to others, consider it oneself, and so on. And I would say this is part of what the life of the mind is for. It's for the sake of thriving, and the thriving is accomplished, at least in part, by coming to know one's world in a way that can make it hospitable, or at least more hospitable than it would be otherwise. So it's a way of becoming more fully at home. So that might bring us back a little bit to the structural language of music. Mm-hmm. And so music becomes a kind of indicator of one of the central challenges that we have, which is how indeed will I situate myself in the world such that I can thrive, or if not thrive, at least be okay. Mm-hmm. And I think the challenges are more severe these days than mm-hmm. they may have been before. Not that I'm buying into a full declinist narrative, but I think I can at least say that this era may not be worse than others, but it's different than others. It's got its own way of being challenging.
Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting, and I wonder how you think about it when we get to senior year, where in some sense, both our philosophic and literary readings seem to almost pose a challenge to this notion of coherence. Mm-hmm. In some way we feel as though something has gone wrong. How do you think about that?
Sure. I think we have a couple of tendencies in the traditions that we deal with in the undergraduate program. There from the very start, there's a kind of restlessness and also an impulse toward order. So in the Odyssey of Homer, which our freshmen read, Odysseus is away from home. He's struggling to get home. He undergoes these various adversities. He's also adventuring along the way. Mm-hmm. And then in the Hebrew scriptures, in the book of Genesis, which we read in the sophomore year, we have an expulsion from the garden. And so that's another kind of alienation, or not being in the place one would want to be. Mm-hmm. So you have a narrative in the tradition of the Greeks, and you have a narrative in the Jewish tradition, and both of those are talking about things not quite being right, and what it's like to not be where you would want to be, mm-hmm. And to be wandering. For example, in the book of Exodus. So that's one tendency, and then we start to get a strong sense of clarity in the theological tradition and the philosophic tradition as we sort of address the restlessness through trying to find ordered ways of understanding ourselves and understanding a cosmos. And that's an effort which by early modernity gets moved out of a religious frame into and it becomes a kind of secular endeavor, the rise of science and technology. So if we started out aware of the liability to not have things as we want them to be, mm-hmm. That introduces a kind of insecurity, and then there's a seeking of security, the security, for example, of religious salvation. But by early modernity, with people like Bacon and Descartes, there's a sense that we will seek security elsewhere. We're going to seek it through human endeavor, and this is part of the sort of the advent of the modern condition. So, to oversimplify quite a lot, there's some way in which by the time we get to senior year, what we're seeing is some of the results of that effort. There was this effort to become more self-sufficient in a strictly human sphere, it turns out somehow that doesn't work as well as we'd like. On the other hand, the older approaches don't appear persuasive to all of us, and so that introduces a kind of tension, which you see in War and Peace, where those characters are discussing problems about the meaning of life. Same thing in Brothers Karamazov. And in Brothers Karamazov, you especially see the problem of suffering. That suffering is central to the human experience and is part of what raises the question of what life is for and what it means, and the question of to what extent suffering can be alleviated. And I think that also shows up in some of the texts we read later on concerning the history of slavery in America. And it becomes clear that there's immense suffering that we inflict on one another, and it's not. And we have to work through how is it possible to have a world that's more just. So the overall, and this is just me sort of putting forward a very simplistic account, but it's helpful, I think, for the educational project to have some rough sense of what things might amount to, and then you try to stay open to revising it as you find it insufficient. We're aware of alienation and difficulty as a fundamental condition of being human. That's there from the outset, and it's present in everyone's experience day to day. And whether through religion or philosophy, there are these efforts to find a more stable sense of assurance, a sense that there might be an ultimate order. And especially in our current time, this is very helpful because we're sort of impoverished with regard to models of ways of being human. What's conventionally presented is so narrow. There are very few models. It's being a consumer, or being an earner, or being an economic actor, or being or sort of elaborating one's selfhood in some way. And those are some of the visions that are available to us if we're just sort of inhabiting the popular culture. But what's helpful for most of us, or would be helpful, is to have a broader palette of possibilities, a broader set of visions of what it could mean to be human. And I think that's part of what we do in the program is walk through quite a few of those. In any case, we have the sense of alienation as a fundamental difficulty. We see these different ways of trying to resolve it. But something happens in the modern era and it's creeping up on us for a long time, but it becomes especially difficult in the last couple of centuries. I'm not sure how to characterize it exactly, but something about where we end up makes meaning hard to get hold of. And by this I mean the kind of meaning that would actually animate your daily life and give you a sense that you know where you stand, or you know how to proceed.
And that goes back to the beginning of the conversation, insofar as we're thinking about art as maybe a place where meaning like that could be expressed. Is that, maybe we can shift into thinking a little bit about your own relationship to your own art and this question.
Yeah.
But so if we think about art as a place where, in a world maybe impoverished of models for meaning, that's the call. Is that how you're thinking about it?
Despite being a kind of amateur practitioner myself of something like art, I have mixed feelings about its sufficiency. I think what it does for me is it helps me apprehend a kind of unity to experience that might otherwise be hard to get hold of. And I think that's a good practice, and I think that's it's been very nourishing to me. So what I've been doing on and off since I was a teenager is doing black and white photography, first in film, with film, and then more recently digital. And that has somehow always felt of a piece with the more sort of abstract or linguistic or conversational or book-oriented efforts. And so it's not that it's disconnected for me from let's say the philosophic project, but I don't know whether I can subsist on just what I get from trying to see the world, trying to step into a kind of coherent vision through artistic practice. Mm-hmm. But maybe all that means is that the same provisionality that I think applies to philosophic work also applies to art. That I would be foolish to think that I'm already in possession of some complete answer or some complete response. Mm-hmm. I do think having these things as ways of being tethered are very helpful and great sources of joy. So they're very good on that level, and I guess to go back to the sense of contingency, the part of what we emphasize here, and I think it's very important, is that we mean to ask questions, consequential questions, but we also are very suspicious of any tendency to prematurely settle on some kind of finished solution. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a way in which we continue to be wandering a little bit like Odysseus, that we're sort of, we want to explore plenty of things, and we expect to arrive home, but there's some way in which to settle prematurely would be a problem.
I guess I wanted to not leave this yet, because I wanted to ask a little bit about, you make a nice comparison between the kind of work we do here and what it means to engage artistically with the world. But I wanted to ask, and this is partly just because I think that you have lots of interests that are kind of, we can talk about this, but in conversations, a kind of something about the world and the resistance of the world and being in the world and doing things. It's a dangerous dichotomy to have that and then the life of the mind. Yeah. I don't think that's quite right, but because you are someone who sort of dives into that realm of making, if we could reflect a little bit on the difference. So there are these similarities, but in your experience doing photography, what's different about using your hands, or can you talk about that sort of world-making thing that happens in photography versus, say, the way we find meaning in the books? Mm-hmm.
Being embodied, being in the world, knowing how to fix things, knowing how to make things, which could be everything from knowing how to do things with machines to knowing how to, repair something in your house, knowing how to cook, knowing how to make clothing. That these are all activities which, though some of them are newish, like working on engines and things. These are deep, durable aspects of being human, and they are really important to our being full human beings. And if one were to try to inhabit a realm of pure abstraction or a realm of pure thought, that wouldn't be a happy condition. And now someone at this point might bring up the kinds of claims that get made about contemplation in the ancients and also in like Dante's Divine Comedy, where there's some kind of vision of the ultimate, and it looks to be a vision that wouldn't have a lot to do with gritty things like eating, or taking a walk out in a world of stuff. But to me, it seems that these embodied activities are contemplative activities and are not fundamentally different from a direct apprehension of what's real. So if you were to have a kind of theological vision of the deepest reality of things, I'm not sure that would be distinguishable from what it's like to have already had. It wouldn't be of a different kind. It'd be distinguishable, but not a totally different kind of thing from what it's like to have a deep relation to the things around you and to have a kind of a sort of intimacy with one's world. So I think what I'm after, or what I mean to say, is that there's a kind of there's something contemplative in embodied experience, and contemplation is not something remote from or disdainful of very ordinary things like the wilderness, like the various implements one uses to get things done. So the intellectual project, the project of reading and thinking and discussing that we undertake here, and which is a kind of introduction to this lifelong undertaking of the life of the mind, that I see as being oddly it's not at a different level or in some other realm from knowing how to be in the world, which is maybe an odd claim. I don't know if it would make sense, but that's how it looks.
I like the claim. It leads me to another question, which is when we're thinking about our lack of models, say, and you listed a number which I'm not going to be able to remember, but things like consumption and maybe sort of self expression in a certain way, different models we have of living meaningful lives, which maybe are deficient in some way, not enough in some way. When you bring the philosophical sort of life of the mind, where one might think, well, the way back, the way to a more meaningful ground might be to engage these deeper thoughts. Some people turn to religion, to get something soulful in some way.
Yeah.
But by weaving it together, as you just have, and I appreciate, with just doing stuff in the world, that those aren't actually separate activities, it does make me wonder what kind of model, if we were to imagine models, it doesn't look as though the model would necessarily, or even sort of, we wouldn't privilege, I'm not the wise, sort of yogi outside the world who
Right.
knows, and we go and seek wisdom from. You're suggesting something much more integrated.
Yeah, I don't think that renunciation is where it's at, because separation from the ordinary, to my mind, has to be for the sake of the ordinary. That is to say, it's not that life as lived is some kind of terrible thing that we ought to denounce, and there's some other pursuit that would be better. It's rather that to whatever extent we step away from the ordinary, as one does when when going to college, for example, it's for the sake of becoming better attuned to the real, where one presupposes a fairly nuanced sense of what the real is. The real is not just pursuing economic goods, for example. And this is what's so I think vivifying about what we do at St. John's, is that one sees very powerfully portrayed these other understandings, whether it might not, like a vision of the human being that's not economic, not reductive.
I'm trying to think about whether we get an example of a human who is really the intersection where the philosophical meets the, I don't know what we want to call it, ordinary life.
Yeah.
We get a lot of characters who struggle with that kind of tension. And then we get theoretical characters like Kierkegaard's Night of Faith, I would say, for me, as an example, it's, on the kind of landing of the Night of Faith in the ordinary world, he looks just like everyone else. He goes home and enjoys his pot roast, or I think is compared to the tax collector. There's no difference, no wavering difference between a being who is walking through the world in ordinary ways, embodied, and one who has sort of access to this nuanced sense of the real that make those ordinary ways somehow not superficial, but the deepest thing. But I wonder if we have examples. I think it's hard when you think about it, what that model would look like, because the danger is we take just the worldly stuff, right? So it's not clear to me it's enough of an example to watch someone really enjoying their food or really enjoying or being, swept up in some kind of activity. Maybe it's something we sense. So if you have a musician, say, who is very much engaged in their musical activity, fully embodying it, maybe that's what we mean by powerful music, is someone who is somehow, through the utterly ordinary, transporting us in a way that we can't deny. We don't need to go and then think about it. We sort of are present with it. And that might be something like a model of this conjunction.
Yeah, you're asking for some character who would represent the full integration. I do think that guy in the Kierkegaard account is helpful here. That he's going to be pretty ordinary in the way he comes across, but he is, while he's out in the world, thinking about the dinner that he'll have when he gets home. And that's something about the dignity of the ordinary. And it's its own kind of miniature homecoming. I mean, it's not sort of, it doesn't have the scale of what we see in the Odyssey, but it's showing something about what human fullness would look like. I think my larger sense about this is that we get little hints here and there. We don't often get a full picture because the full picture is going to look mythical. What we have instead is these little insinuations that show up in poetry and in the more sort of poetic mode of philosophy, like you have in Plato and Kierkegaard.
What do you mean it would show up as mythical?
I think it starts looking like you're talking about human perfection rather than what it is to be human, as most of us find credible. And so, stories of divine characters or characters who are not ordinary. Those are the sorts of persons that represent the wholeness fully, but what we find more often in literature is figures who have some portion of it. So again, if you look at Dostoevsky, there these different brothers in the Brothers Karamazov seem to be conveying different aspects of humanity, but there's no single one who seems to have it all. Even though maybe some of them are more admirable than others.
Yeah, it reminds me of Virginia Woolf. I just did a precept on Virginia Woolf, and especially in The Waves, although I think in all of her works. So you were just thinking about that partiality in terms of the brothers representing different parts. We can't get the whole, that would look divine. And my sense is that Virginia Woolf does it sort of temporally, the notion that you don't always get to sit in the seat of this conjunction.
Yeah.
And that's not tragic, that's human.
Yeah.
And I think she does a lot of work, especially at the end of that book, where we get this character. I don't know if you've read it recently, but Bernard, everyone has struggled throughout the book, sort of feeling enlivened and present and full, and then alienated and distanced. And he's an old man at this point. And he goes from maybe one of his lowest moments of feeling like disconnected from the world. There is no point. People don't see him. And he walks out of this restaurant and it's sort of, maybe it has just rained and it's an evening and he feels, it's not even his choice. It just happens. He feels enlivened. And he's suspicious of it because he knows the way it comes and it goes. And he sort of has this moment of like, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to get back on the horse because of course I'm going to get back on the horse. And it's such a beautiful moment of sort of onward, despite the fact that of course it's never, you never get to land in it fully.
Yeah.
So that temporal version of you feel it and you don't feel it, you feel it and you don't feel it, you can take that, and I think we read people who do, as this is the unhappy consciousness. This is a sign of deficiency. If we could sort of be our full, fully realized, that would cease being the case. And then we get authors that I find really persuasive who make it a case, this is what it means to be human. And that means that when you're down and out, you're actually, you don't get to talk yourself out of that quite, but with a certain perspective, you recognize it as part of the whole, yeah.
Yeah, there's maybe a kind of perfectionism that is that can be a problem because it falsifies experience. That actual experience has that up and down quality and that sense of being kind of messy and often very unpleasant. And there's a kind of honesty in the books you describe, and somehow, well, it would seem to me that part of our goal in learning about ourselves and learning about the world would be to get to the point where one is not inclined to kind of adopt an escapist perfectionism, where you sort of say, well, this is all much too grubby and undignified, and there ought to be some other way of doing things that would allow me to evade these experiential problems. I think part of what happens in popular music in the 20th century is a kind of embrace of the fact that ordinary life is difficult, and you see this in blues and jazz, that in contrast to the way that music had sometimes posited a kind of tidy home. The blues and jazz traditions seem to say there isn't going to be a home that's simply resolved, and I think that's a response to suffering and a kind of a way of it's a kind of wise acknowledgement of the way that things will not become simple for us. And it might be that music and literature and other forms of art can help us be more adaptable or more resilient in the face of the inevitable difficulties.
So I feel like one might hear the distinction between sort of the life of the mind and this embodied life and think that they are separate things, sort of that you're drawing our attention to this embodied, less coherent sort of messiness. But it feels like you're doing something more than that. Can you talk about the relationship between those two a little as you see it?
Sure. I think what we're doing when we have the kinds of conversations we have at St. John's, which are always grounded in some particular text and can sometimes seem very abstract or very, very, very much not concerned with the tangible. I think what we're doing is learning how to be more fully ourselves, and that's going to fit with being more fully present in the world and being better at thriving. I don't ultimately see an important distinction between what I'm calling the life of the mind and fully being in the world. That this is a unified pursuit. That it's who we are as human beings, that we want to reflect on and understand our experience. And these books that we read are highly elaborated, extremely sophisticated approaches to what it is to be human. But they're not separate from being human. They're in some kind of interplay with the dailiness of being human. When the distinction comes up between sort of thought on the one hand and life on the other, that seems to me a not very helpful distinction, and one which is a kind of distraction that it's our tendency as human beings to think about what happens, what we see, what we undergo, the world that we encounter. We want to understand it. We want to have some kind of insight about it, and so the life of thinking and discussing is of a piece with just sort of ordinary doing and ordinary living. And I might even go so far as to say that part of what we try to do here is to chip away at or diminish that distinction, which is an artificial distinction to begin with. The sense that there's some kind of really brainy thing that one does over here that's removed from ordinary life, and then over here is what everyone else is doing. That's a false distinction. One of the really remarkable claims that's implicit to the activity at St. John's is that a life of thinking and reading and conversing is something that belongs to everyone. That it's not a sort of it's not a kind of removed activity just for the few. It's an activity that all of us have access to simply because we're human beings. And so just as there's not a kind of there's not properly a division among different sorts of people, where some people some people can do this and they do it because it's prestigious or it makes them feel special, and other people don't do it or can't do it. It's more like this is something which all of us do already from childhood. We're asking questions about the world. We're trying to understand the world. A small child is constantly asking, why are things this way, or what is that? They're trying to understand. They're asking these questions. That's a kind of picture of what it is to be human for all of us. That we all have that kind of disposition to try to understand, and therefore a really intensive activity like what we do at St. John's is really something that belongs to everyone. So there's no kind of division among types of people as far as I'm concerned, and there's also not a kind of division in my own approach where I sort of have a partition. Like there's practical stuff over here, and then there's thinky stuff over here. It's more like when I'm doing something like trying to make an image in photography, or trying to fix something around the house, there are things to reflect on there. And there are aspects of that activity that bring me into fuller touch with something like a full world. Mm-hmm. And that nearly everything in one's experience is appropriate for thinking, is appropriate to wonder about and to have a kind of exhilarated, reflective relation to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really nice. It strikes me that idea of being in touch with a fuller world, mm-hmm. a more full world, and the way that can happen, that's something like the goal. Because I think that the same way you can go about your business and sort of fix things in your house or do what you need to do a little bit mindlessly. I mean, so much of our life is spent that way. You can also do intellectual activity that way.
Yeah.
Just because you're saying the words doesn't mean you're actually sort of present to the world that you're engaging with. So I like the bridge, because it does seem to me the goal is to live in that enhanced relationship to the world as much as we can. And it's that versus the sort of sleepwalking version that we're after. And to separate it as the thinking stuff and sort of like the ordinary stuff and then the intellectual stuff, that seems to be a really false dichotomy to me.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is part of why we try to avoid conventionalized thinking. Part of why we spend so much time with questions. It's not because it's necessarily good for us to just constantly be at a loss with regard to things and sort of be kind of stuck in some kind of perplexity. Perplexity is very productive, but what we're doing when we ask questions, I think, is avoiding being on a sort of pre-established track that would be just a kind of a canned or conventional way of thinking. So we don't want to be on autopilot when it comes to our thought. So that sounding smart would be another ritualized thing, just like like washing the dishes. Mm-hmm. So I think we're trying to see the world as a whole, and we're trying to see ourselves to whatever extent possible as complete, and seeing an integration among the different things that we do. And not choosing any particular aspect of human existence and saying, well, that's low and not worth our attention. It's all worth our attention, and nearly everything can be thought about, and thought about in a way that feels fresh, like that we're really trying to understand it, and we're not simply bringing a set of prepared notions, and trying to reassure ourselves with some kind of ready-made understanding.
That's really nice. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I did too.
Okay.